serious. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this public defense of the thesis entitled Social Relations in Organized Youth Sport, Networks, Gender, Status, Friends, and Education. Today's candidate, Håvard Bergesen, Dalen, completed his thesis in March 2024. Based on a proposal from the Department of Sport and Social Sciences, the Committee for Research Education has appointed the following committee to judge the thesis and the requirements for the award. Professor Sigmund Roland, Norwegian School of Sport Sciences, Chairperson. Professor Nick Crossley, University of Manchester, first opponent. Professor Anne Kjøndal, Nord University, second opponent. The committee has concluded that the thesis meets the standard worthy of a public defense for the award of Doctor of Philosophy, PhD in Sport Science. Earlier today, the candidate has given a trial lecture with the title Discuss the Potential of Knowledge Generated by Social Network Analysis in the Efforts of Sports Organizations to Recruit and Retain Members. The trial lecture has been found satisfactory by the examination committee. I now would like to ask the candidate to introduce his doctoral research in the form of a short lecture, and the opposing members of the examination committee to engage the candidate in defense of the work. Should members of the audience wish to ask questions related to the research, I ask you to bring these in written form to me in the break prior to the second opponent's questions. Then I ask the candidate to take his place at the lectern.
Dear Rector, dear committee, dear supervisors, dear colleagues, and everyone else in the audience, thank you for being here today. The title of my dissertation is Social Relations in Organized Youth Sports, Networks, Gender, Status, Friends, and Education. In this presentation, I will cover the main points of my PhD project. First, I will introduce the topic. I then present materials and methods. After that, I outline the results from the articles. Finally, I discuss the value of my work and offer some practical implications of my findings. So, why a study of social relations in sports? First of all, over 90% of Norwegian youth take part in sports at some point during their upbringing. The Norwegian government also invests a significant amount of money into sports, expecting it to serve wider social functions, including support for education. Sport also faces a number of challenges. One is attracting new members and keeping them involved. Achieving this depends on several related issues, such as social inequalities, gender issues, enjoyment, and handling competition and performance demands. Also, sports is often described and presented in idealized ways in policy pamphlets and in popular culture. This can create the impression that sport works the same way for everyone. This is not correct. The reality is that sport teams are unique micro-worlds with their own members, interactions, and relations, and need to be studied as such. Taken together, the popularity, challenges, and stereotypical portraits of sports raise questions about what actually goes on in sports. Against this background, the purpose of this project has been to gain a better understanding of sports as a social arena. I have focused on 4 distinct aspects. The first is the structural profile of social relations in sport teams. This I have investigated by describing social networks in sports teams. The second aspect concerns where these social relations and networks come from. What are the driving forces behind their development? I have approached this topic by examining how athletes' relations in sports depend on their social relations outside of sports, in school, in leisure activities, and on social media. The third aspect is the social significance of sports. I have studied this by examining the social status of sports among Norwegian youth in general and among a set of athletes actively involved in sports. The fourth and final aspect is the social consequences of sports as a social arena. I have approached this by examining young athletes' school outcomes in relation to their social experiences in sport. How then do we study relations in sports? A common procedure is qualitative analysis through narratives. Narrative analysis focuses on personal stories of the athletes involved. Now, while these narratives give vivid descriptions of athletes' subjective experiences and their contributions to social interaction, you could say that a limitation in this approach is that the relations themselves remain somewhat undefined. They're in the background, a bit obscure. We can see sort of the relationship between dyads, a coach-athlete's relationships, for example, but you can't really see the relationships between the coach and the athletes within a social system, a structure of relations, and how these interact. So, in this project, and inspired by relational sociology, I have taken a somewhat different approach and focused on studying concrete social relations between athletes in teams. To study social relations, I have used social network analysis. Social network analysis is a set of theories and methods specifically designed to examine the appearance and function of social networks. I have studied 2 distinct types of networks, which I have called strong and weak networks. Strong networks, in my dissertation, are made up of close, demanding, and intimate relations, which I have captured from respondents' information about who they usually shared hotel rooms with or slept next to during away games and competitions. Weak networks typically consists of more casual and less committed interactions. This I have assessed by asking athletes about who they usually talk to during breaks in practice sessions. The visualization we see on the screen displays a social network of weak relations from one of the teams in my sample. The athletes are represented as red dots, while the lines between them are their relations. I have described the networks on 3 features. The first, it reveals social hierarchies and power dynamics. Third, I have looked at what we call clustering, the tendency for athletes to come together and form subgroups in networks. This can also help us understand the level of social unity within teams. I gathered data by visiting teams where respondents answered a survey on iPads, typically before or after training sessions or at other social gatherings. The respondent answered questions about various aspects of their sports participation. This included their performance levels and enjoyment as measured on a 0 to 10 scale. Furthermore, they answered a set of statements about the status of sports and other status marker using a Likert scale from 1 to 5 as adopted by the National Representative Ungdata Survey. They then answered the questions about strong and weak social relations in sports and about their engagement in non-sport activities with their fellow athletes. This data was used to create the social networks. Lastly, the respondents provided information about their social background and school life, including their grades, time spent on homework, and interest in school. A total of 510 athletes consented to participate in the study. Out of these, 387 completed the survey, resulting in a response rate of 75%. The gender distribution was 57% male and 43% female, with an average age of 17 years. Overall, respondents from 30 teams from 8 different counties were surveyed, with 11 football teams, 11 handball teams, and 8 cross-country and biathlon teams. The average team had 13 members. And now over to analysis and findings. Article 1. Article 1 is co-authored with Professor Ernulf Seipel. The research question was as follows. What do social networks in sport teams look like? And how do we explain differences between girls and boys' social networks in sport? The figure on the screen shows the strong social networks from the team in Madeira. Green color represent mixed gender teams. Blue are male teams, and red are female teams. The first thing we notice is that strong relations are scarce in most teams, and many athletes are isolates who seem to lack intimate relations to their co-athletes. This is as expected. Strong relations, they require effort and resemble best friend behavior. They are typically personal, intimate, demanding, and limited in numbers. Regarding the distribution of relations, we expected that athletes would form connections with a small number of people they trust, resulting in an even distribution. As shown in the figure, this expectation is confirmed. In most teams, the majority of athletes either keep to themselves or have strong relations with a small number of co-athletes. Finally, the strong networks were not very clustered and contained few local subgroups. This is the weak sport networks. As we can see, relations are much more numerous and less evenly distributed than in the strong network. This is also as expected, as these, we can call them surface level relationships, are less costly to establish and maintain, and there is less at stake if they were to fail. Finally, it may be hard to see from the visuals, but the weak networks are more clustered and contain more subgroups within the larger network than the strong networks. As for gender differences for these networks, 3 main findings emerged. First, girls' teams contained more relations in both the strong and weak networks compared to the boys' teams. We explain this as girls having a higher inclination towards establishing social relations, and that we maybe have overvalued the cost of establishing failed social relations. Furthermore, when it comes to the distribution of relations, we anticipated that social relations would be more evenly distributed in girls' networks than in boys' networks, because boys typically are portrayed to be more open to asymmetry in social relations. However, the results showed no differences between both girls' and boys' networks when it came to the distribution. Lastly, we found that girls' networks were more clustered and contained more subgroups than the boys' networks. We suggested the explanation that girls invest more in their relationships, leading to more selective connections, ultimately resulting in clustering. Overall, the findings in the article demonstrate that the sociability of sports teams is very much salient, but also that it differs very much between teams and based on the strength of networks and gender. We take this to indicate that sports teams probably play very different roles when it comes to fulfilling the many social visions ascribed to them. How participation is experienced, how inclusive they are, how structures contribute to performance, and their ability to convey social capital. Article 2. Article 2, also co-authored by Professor Seipel, follows up on Article 1 by examining where the social networks in sports come from. We asked, how does the quantity and quality of young athletes' social relations in sports depend on social relations outside of sports? Young people are social on many fronts, and we examined whether interacting in school, non-sport leisure activities, and on social media apps such as Snapchat impact the likelihood of forming relations in sport. Theoretically, to sort out how social networks outside of sports could matter for networks in sports, we relied on 3 social mechanisms. Contact theory states that people have to meet physically in space and time to develop social networks. Hence, contact theory highlights how relations in sports could be strengthened if athletes meet and interact outside of sports. Contagion describes how people meeting through certain networks become more similar to each other. This implies that athletes who spend time together outside of sports could become more alike, thereby increasing the chance of becoming friends in sports. The third mechanism is homophily. The idea is that people who see each other as similar are more likely to be attracted to one another and form social relations. For example, athletes who are met outside of sports might be inclined to seek each other out in sports because they are similar in terms of other social experiences and interests. For our analysis, we utilized a statistical tool called exponential randomized graph models. These models, which is interpreted much the same way as logistic regression models, predicted the effect of belonging to the same school, leisure, or social media network would have on the probability that a pair of athletes would have a social relation. The main finding in the article is that social relations do indeed matter for relations in sports, but there are nuances. Interacting on social media and meeting in non-sport leisure networks increase the probability of developing relations in sports. Attending the same school is less important. Article 3. The third article, also crafted with Professor Seipel, is called Social Status in Sports, a Study of Young Norwegians. The research question was as follows. To what extent does sport give social status to Norwegian youth and athletes? Moreover, we asked, how is the status of sports influenced by age, gender, and socioeconomic status? Finally, competition and performance are central to sport, so we asked, how important is sport performance to athletes' social status? To assess the status of sports among Norwegian youth, we used data from the nationally representative Ungdata survey. For status among athletes, we used my self-collected data from athletes active in organized sport. For the status of sport, we found that sport has high status among both young Norwegians in general and young athletes involved in sports. It ranked 3rd in the general youth population and, not surprisingly, at the top among young athletes. We argue that what makes sport special for status is that it reflects many social trends of our time. It represents post-material values, emphasizing quality of life. It is also serious and competitive, and it is health and body-oriented. However, we also find that the status of sports drops with age, both in the general youth population and among young athletes. For gender, sport has a higher status among boys in the general youth population. Among athletes, we find the opposite, with girls ascribing more status to sport. We see this as a selection effect that reflects the gender status hierarchy in the general population, where girls in sports are given lower status than boys. For social class, sports has a high status across different class levels. To better understand status mechanisms within sport teams, we examined the connection between athletes' rating of each other's popularity, likability, and sport performance. The findings were clear. The athletes who were rated highest by their co-athletes on non-sport performance were also the most popular and best liked. We take this to indicate that sport performance reflects social structures and status hierarchies within sport. Overall, the results in Article 3 show that sports has a high status among Norwegian youth, but also that there are differences along the lines of age, gender, and cultural class. Finally, social mechanisms inside sports, here represented as sport performance levels, seems to matter for athletes' individual social status within teams. In this way, status gives direction and intensity to individual experiences of what is valuable. The best athletes probably enjoy sport more, develop significant social relations to co-athletes, and are more committed to sports. Article 4. The research question was as follows. How is the quality of the sport experience significant for how young athletes perform at school and show interest in education? In the literature, there are two contrasting ideas about the relationship between sports and school. The first is that sports is negative for school by taking up too much time and attention. The other emphasizes that sports promote enjoyment and teach skills like hard work, character, and cooperation, all of which can be useful in school. To test these ideas, I have examined athletes' school outcomes in relation to how athletes experience sports, their sense of enjoyment in sports, and their sports performance levels. Enjoyment can be seen as an expression of general life satisfaction and the development of supportive social relations. When it comes to performance, becoming a skilled athlete takes time. It requires dedication, and it is assumed to teach the value of hard work. And as shown in Article 3, the top athletes have high social status, which can increase self-esteem and lead to positive attention from fellow students and teachers. The analysis involved a regression model where athletes' grades, time spent on homework, and interest in school as response variables predicted by sport enjoyment and sport performance levels. The results showed that athletes' grades, time spent on homework, and interest in school vary in accordance with their enjoyment and performance levels. Sport enjoyment positively correlated with school interest. In terms of sport performance, the best performing athletes achieved better grades in physical education, but they did less homework and had fewer academic ambitions compared to more average performing athletes. Overall, the findings indicate that athletes' social and sporting adaptation in sports need to be seen in relation to school. Finally, some words on key contributions. First, my project is among the first to focus on concrete social relations in sports. In doing so, it advances our knowledge on social relations in sports, both structurally as social networks and culturally in relation to gender patterns and status mechanisms within sports. Second, I show how using social network analysis offers a new and interesting prism to study relations in sports. Social networks in sports evolve from athletes interacting with one another. This gives way to new structures that has implications for individual experiences and at the team level, for example, for performance. Understanding networks is therefore essential to understand how sports teams work, evolve over time, and the implications for the athletes in them. Third, this dissertation provides important insights for sports organizations working with sport participation. The high status of sports means that sports is attractive. This is a good starting point for recruitment. However, we also find that the status of sports drops with age, implying that social experiences and relations in sports decrease in importance with age. This can help us understand dropout from sport. We also find that sports convey less status for girls. Accordingly, girls have to be more devoted to sport to stay on. Moreover, continued participation requires vibrant social relations inside sports. And these social relations benefit from the same people being together outside of sports. Accordingly, sports organizations and clubs need to be aware of their role in athletes' lives, and they can probably benefit from partnering with schools and other organizations to keep youth engaged in sports, and also perhaps secure a more dignified exit for those who want out. Also, my mapping of social networks revealed that many athletes lack social connections with their team members, which increase the chance of dropout. Finally, the high-performing athletes do less homework and show less interest in education compared to the teammates needs addressing. While this simply could be due to a lack of interest in school, it may also indicate that success in sports comes at a cost. The challenge of balancing sports and education has mainly been studied among elite athletes. But my research showed that sports clubs, schools, and us in the scientific community need to be aware and look more closely at this issue among athletes taking part in grassroots sports as well. And this concludes my summary of my thesis. Thank you.
Thank you to the candidate for the presentation of your thesis. Then it's time to invite first of all Professor Nick Crossley to engage the candidate in a discussion of the thesis.
Can everybody, I don't need a microphone, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. And even with my Manchester accent, you can stand up and say, okay, good. So I should begin by saying sort of thank you for this. I think this is an excellent thesis, 4 really good papers. 3 of which have already been published, which is very impressive, I think, and a 4th, which I found fascinating and very well written, and I'm sure will be published when it's been refereed and so on. So yeah, I mean, I should begin by saying I'm impressed by the thesis. I think it's a very good. It's a very good piece of work. I'm struggling now to think which way round to tackle things and address things, but I think what I'll perhaps do is begin by focusing on the papers specifically, and then do some more general questions after we've done that, if we have time. And perhaps in response to some of my questions, you might want to fill out the details in the context of the people in the audience as well, because I'm going to dive into the detail a little bit, which I'm aware some people won't be available to them. But anyway, okay. So if we begin with paper 1, as you've just explained to people, you took 3 very specific measures. You took average degree, centralisation, and clustering. And I wonder if you could just perhaps tell us a little bit more about why specifically you decided on those measures. I mean, did that relate to hypotheses that you had about what it was about social networks that ought to have an effect? I mean, why those, I suppose, is the question.
Yeah, I guess that I think they were chosen on the background of the context that we're studying. I think that that's where it basically comes from. That we expected certain sort of cultural sides about sports be revealed using those measures. I think that's probably where it started. And of course, so like we wanted to see, or I wanted to see, like we want to know how sport teams operate. So I talked about like cohesion. For sport teams to be a good, solid, well-functioning team, it needs to be some sort of social unity between athletes and the team as a whole. Hence, we wanted to look at clustering. Do the team sort of split up in different camps for some reason, which obviously can be very damaging, both socially but also for performance, for example. And you know, when you study the degree, you also get sort of a bit like the same thing. You sort of get a feel both for individual sort of athletes' position in teams, and also for the, as I said, the general level of sociability in teams, which I just assumed will be important for being like a well-functioning team. Same thing with decentralization. It captures some like a different side of teams. For example, I said like it tells us about power, social hierarchies, stuff like that, which exists in teams. So we wanted to see like, okay, how does this look like? We say that it exists. We have to sort of see, okay, what does it actually look like then? So that's basically, I think, sort of the rationale for choosing those measures. And like to sort of address what we actually did, I'd like to sort of follow up. You probably have a question, but I'm just going to go on. Like my sort of, or the way we sort of approach this topic of sort of describing teams is very like, how should I put this? It's like very, you sort of, it's kind of crude in a way that what we do. You sort of, it's like it's the positive and the negative side of what we do. We sort of strip away everything that's sort of in these relations. We take away everything, like, right? We sort of systemize, standardize everything, and then you're sort of left with the structure. That was the thing that was interesting in finding, right? And when you sort of standardize, everybody's treated the same way, right? And you systemize because there's a lot of relations, especially in the weak networks. We expected that, so we have to do it this way, right? And then you're left with the structure. So you sort of get a feel for what these teams sort of look. You can see what they look like, and you sort of, you can't really directly address like, for example, we didn't do it, we looked at gender, but we haven't sort of, for example, looked at sport performance levels in relation to the structures that we see and so on and so forth. That's like, I feel like that's sort of the next step in this work, to sort of approach these things, which sort of will help to give more like explanatory powers of the measures that we used. Yeah, I think I'm going to stop there.
So you've kind of answered what was going to be one of my follow-on questions, was that you don't have an outcome measure against which to assess the impact of these different
No. I've tried to look at outcomes.
Yeah.
There's two ways to sort of approach networks. One is to sort of use statistical modeling and descriptions to sort of figure out what they look like. The other one, you can use to sort of flip it, use them as to sort of look for outcomes, see them in relation to outcomes. So I tried doing that, but in relation to, for example, sport performance levels. But I couldn't really get the models to work. I'm not sure exactly what I work in statistics Norway when I'm not here in school, so I'm sort of used to working with data, and you sort of get a feel for like when data works and when it doesn't. And I just realized that this time using it as an output won't work. Could be the measures, the way we operationalized the networks. It could be linked to sample size. I'm not sure, but yeah, it didn't really pan out. So then you sort of take a different turn and do something else.
Okay. Yeah. Fine. So just another couple of questions about those networks. Firstly, so your strong ties, the networks were very sparse for your strong ties, which made me wonder whether that was because most people's strong connections were outside of their sport. I mean, would that be, do you think, is that that actually sport was perhaps an arena for casual socialization, casual relationships, but it wasn't really where people had their strongest relations? Or would that be your conclusion? Or?
Yeah, that's certainly possible. Absolutely. I guess that's fair to sort of assume that.
Sorry, I know you haven't researched. I'm asking you. I haven't been asking to speculate about things that you haven't researched.
Yeah, sure. I sort of, I did someone in the trial lecture, and we probably will get to Article 2, and we will show that life inside and outside sports is connected. So it's a fair assumption to assume that we know that these people socialize outside of sports, many of them. So of course they will have probably strong relations outside of sports. That doesn't mean that we can't sort of figure out what's going on within the context of sports. Like, they're not sort of, you can do both, right? So we were kind of more interested in figuring out, that was our approach, strong relations in sports. So, yeah, but so you're sort of...
It might tell us something about sport, that yes, sport is an important arena for sociability, but certain kinds of sociability more than others, possibly.
Yeah, maybe. Also, you sort of, I think that there's sort of two parallel sort of discussions there, because one thing is that what we're talking about now, and sort of, I want to use this opportunity to sort of, I do it in the article as well, like, you learn stuff when you sort of do a PhD, right?
Yeah.
So I was, when I started this project, I didn't know anything about social network analysis. It was very, pretty much like a crash course in network. I had to be quick, right? And I had to develop a survey, and I had to get started with the data collection pretty quickly. And so in hindsight, I would probably sort of, let's say, I want to look at strong relations in sports. I would do it in a different way than what I ended up doing. Like, if I could do it all over again, I would probably sort of try to capture strong relations in a different way. Because I think that's a maybe even more important issue here. That's the way we sort of try to capture strong relations, the measure that we actually ended up using, staying in our hotel rooms or sleeping next to. I would use another measure if I could do it again. Maybe just, I think I say in the article, in the end there, in the data method sections, that I would use a more general general question. For example, if you look at social capital theory, if you look at bonding and bridging, and how we usually sort of capture that kind of ties, we would sort of maybe look more for emotional closeness, for example, best friends behavior and stuff like that. So maybe I would go in that direction, maybe, if I could do it again. The problem here was, of course, that I had large issues with the ethics board when I tried to sort of get my project going, because they had no experience with social network analysis. So I had to say, what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to ask, all athletes athletes in the team, who they like, blah, 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 who they don't like, who's the best athletes, and so on. And they were very skeptical about me asking about things that sort of might reflect negative emotion, things that are difficult for the youth. So I wasn't allowed to ask who they liked, questions of conflict, for example, disliking, stuff like that. So I sort of had to find some kind of middle ground. So that's where I ended up with the question I ended up using.
That's very common with ethics committees and social network analysis.
I think I argued with them for about 7 months before I finally had to give up.
Tougher challenge than this then.
Yeah, anyway.
Also, one of your findings was that the networks vary quite markedly. And I just wondered, again, asking you to speculate, but did you have any reflections on why that might be? I mean, I'll just give you an example, because I did something quite similar to this on tutorial groups at my university, and the social science students, the networks were completely sparse. Most people didn't even know the person they were sat next to in their tutorial group, whereas the medical students, everybody knew everybody. And that was partly just because of the organisation. The medical students firstly had an interest in socialising because their peers were going to be very important to their future career, but also the way that the course was organised was such that they had to socialise with one another. So I mean, did you have any sense of why it was that some sports organisations seem to give rise to more dense networks?
Yeah, sure. I think we have to address the sample. Start there. That's sort of where I want to go. I have handball teams, football teams, and biathlon and ski teams in my sample. And so, the first thing that pops into my head is there's different sport cultures, right? If you say so I have team sports and I have individual sports. We could start by that. One could speculate, for example, that team sports probably are more aware and need sort of tight socialization to sort of operate and function well. That's one thing. Of course, I looked at gender already in the articles. They have more relations. So there's also sort of a gender component going on, maybe. I think it's a psychologist. I think her name is Rubin. She says there's one thing that's not addressed in the article, and that is sort of gendered expression of socialization, to call it that, if you understand what I mean. She talks about boys sort of doing relations, girls being in relations, right? So there might be some kind of the sort of gender aspect of socialization where boys perhaps are more use bodily expressions to communicate and those sort of, that's maybe something that goes on here. And of course, we talk about organizational sort of capacities. That's also probably something that's affecting how teams work. I think it's fair to assume. I have collected data all over the country from areas with teams located in areas with among people with high socioeconomic status, so on, and other teams in other areas, more low income, low social economic status areas. For example, so that can obviously also matter in this case. Parents, so parental involvement, super important in sports. So the sort of network of parents around the athletes also probably, they sort of facilitate social interactions. I would think they can sort of make an impact there. And then of course you have more it can also be I have 30 teams. It can be sort of occasions going on when I sort of collect the data. It can be interpersonal relations, just two people falling out, for example, can cause a lot of things to happen in relations in network. As I said, like there's like a diet of two people. They can have a falling out, and that can affect all other relations in the network, right? And then you have it can be coach-athlete, the coach's role. I tried to collect data on the coaches, but didn't really succeed. They probably have a role in this. So like, there's a lot of potential sources to explain what's going on there. That needs to be followed up.
Okay, well, thanks. Just so one more question on paper one. You've already mentioned the gender, and that was obviously a key focus of the paper. And in a sense, your hypotheses with respect to gender weren't borne out, but you did find gender differences perhaps that you hadn't hypothesized, or I mean, is that something that you would go back to? Is that do you think the gender differences that you found in the networks are do you have thoughts about why you might have found something that was contrary to what you'd originally hypothesized?
Yeah, I think we sort of addressed this in the article. I'm not really sure why, but like I said, that like there seems to be a sort of maybe, as I said, maybe overvalued the like cost of failure. Like if a relationship doesn't pan out, maybe we thought that maybe that would be more costly for girls than for boys, maybe. So I think that's sort of my answer to that. And I don't know. I think it's difficult to speculate based on like the numbers are. I think it's difficult to sort of address the power in the numbers. I wanted, like, if you really want to get into it, you have to sort of follow it up by looking more closely at the type of relations and what goes on in them, and like if there's any specific sort of driving forces that is different between boys and girls. I'm not sure. I think it's a tough question to answer, like on the spot.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks. So. Thanks very much. So if we move on to paper 2. So I suppose one of my key questions that came out of this was that you look at the impact of non-sporting upon sporting relations. How do you know which direction the impact was going in? I mean, in a sense, you were able to explore correlations across the two different types. How did you know that it was the non-sporting that was affecting the sporting and not
I don't really. You sort of what we do is that we sort of we use like sound theory to try to sort of establish a causality. It's pretty common. You sort of seek out. That's what you want to do often. Not always. We wanted that this time. So we use theories to try to sort of make a connections that seems reasonable, and you carry on collecting data, and you see what comes out, and then you get I sort of pushed that as far as I could, maybe too far, some would say, but yeah, basically I don't really know. But it was as close as I could get. So that's what I did. That said, like I'm perfectly open to discuss it. Of course, it can go the other way around, especially with, I think, 2 of the networks. School, I'm not so sure. Like, I think that one's a bit speculative to think that sort of same sport, going to the same sports and make you choose going to sort of the same school. Maybe it was elite sports, but yeah, not this. But the other 2, like leisure networks, like go scouting together after becoming friends in sports, perfectly reasonable to assume that can happen. Also social media, perhaps. Maybe. Social media is I think that one is like a bit tricky. Sort of new. I don't really know how to sort of. It's not much like some theory to sort of use to establish if it's a correlation or causality. But I've been thinking a little about how do you sort of become friends on social media? Like, how does it happen? First, you meet someone usually at least, maybe if you're dating, it's different, but if you sort of, you meet somebody physically at a place, and then you sort of become friends on social media, that I think is like the most common way that happens. And we can't really say that it happens like the causality. I think maybe it's I don't think we can say that it happens in sports and then outside of sports and then it affects sports. So yeah, that one is also a bit tricky. But social media networks, they sort of exist. I see them as existing sort of. It's very difficult to know when they start, but they sort of exist like in a higher level, sort of flow over all the other networks, and that's how I look at them. And then they sort of reinforce and strengthens other networks. That's the way I sort of look at social media networks. And I think that finally I would say, like, even if we sort of say that the way that we have sort of tried to establish a causal link, I think the outcome of the article is still sort of more or less the same. The main point in the article, the main finding is that relations in sports is connected to relationships outside of sports.
Yeah.
So that's sort of, yeah, the value of the article is still the same, even if you might have pushed the sort of causality a little bit maybe too far. And of course this is also a sort of statistical lingo sort of, is also sort of present in the way we write. You know, when you do like statistics, we often use language like we talk about effects. Then it's very like, it's a very causal type of language. What we really sort of say is just, basically we talk about the strength of the correlations, right? But the language can sort of fuses into thinking about this as sort of causal direction.
So it was theoretically motivated.
Yeah.
That was.
Thank you. I could have said it like that. Just shouldn't have said it.
No. But you've kind of explained what some of those motivations. You explained some of that theory, the thought that went behind it. Okay. So I'll just ask one more question about this particular paper. So sorry, this is very page specific. This is on page 4, and it is actually page 4. You've been discussing the Norwegian policy of sport for all, and the fact that a lot of young people drop out of sport. And then in that context, you say the more exclusive a social arena is, the more conducive it is to the development of social relations. And I just wonder if you could, I sort of, that's when I was reading the thesis, that kind of struck out, and that interested me. I mean, it is difficult, I appreciate it, to sort of go back to something so specific, but can you elaborate on that claim? You know, why do you think that exclusive social arenas are particularly conducive to the development of social relations?
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to spend too much time. It requires some kind of commitment, I guess. And with that commitment comes then you sort of get invested. You build an identity around that activity, and you become more, hopefully you become more alike other people in there if you spend time there. Also, my athletes, say if you take like a biathlon athlete or a ski athlete, like my partner Anna is there today. She's a former biathlon athlete. We just sort of last night we just checked what does it cost to buy a gun. It costs 50,000 kroner, so you get invested, economically. So I think that's just sort of with that if you think about it in sort of a life course, this commitment sort of comes with sort of a social responsibility that makes you sort of stay in there. And my athletes are 16, 17, 18, 19 years old, so they've sort of been there for a long time. So that's sort of, the longer you're there, sort of you flesh out those who maybe not sort of have that commitment, and then you're sort of left with those who are committed, and yeah, basically, yeah.
Okay, well thanks. I will just ask one more about this paper. This is a slightly geeky question. So so I apologise for that. But the exponential random graph models that you use. So I am always uncertain quite what we gain by using much more sophisticated statistical methods. Sometimes I sort of think, do we not find out the same things by slightly more straightforward, simpler methods? So did you, what was the gain, do you think, in using exponential random graph models for your findings in paper 2? Did you feel that you had something better and something that you couldn't have achieved within the more basic methods of social network analysis?
Well, I'm just have to check if I understand the question. First of all, I'm not really sure what kind of other methods I would use, but well, you get detailed descriptions of every single team. I guess that's one of the main sort of benefits of using this method. That's the one that sort of struck out for me, that you can sort of you can look at the sort of dependency between networks for each team to get detailed information, I guess, instead of that sort of aggregate, traditional atomic sort of way of studying and studying teams with just sort of aggregate effects that you sort of show you some kind of correlation. Have you sort of get it on the team level, much better understanding of each sort of individual record of data, I guess. And I gotta be honest, for me it was also a very personal sort of decision to use randomized graph models, because it's new, novel, interesting, and fun. So it's sort of I wanted to see what comes out of it, and if you sort of bring something back to the sort of scientific community within sports, I think that we need new methods. Should always be looking for new ways to study things. So yeah.
And your conclusion then, having done that, was this is something I would do again. This is the way I would tackle the approach.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Okay. Our model was pretty basic, right? There was only, what did we put into it? We put into the networks and just the edges, because this is very geeky, but sort of endo-exo. We only looked at like edge as sort of the internal network mechanisms driving forces behind relations. So maybe you can sort of build on this model, make it more, use theory to look at it more closely. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So moving on to paper 3. You partially answered this actually in your presentation, but just to, again, why is sport a source of status, do you think? What's the nature of that connection? Why does participation in sport confer status and success in sport confer status?
Do you mean like the general status of sports within like the peer community overall? I didn't quite.
Yeah. So there's a sense in your paper that particularly among young people, sporting achievement is a source of status. How do you understand the relationship between achievement in a specific domain and then status more broadly amongst your peers and your community?
Yeah, I see. I think I sort of I touched upon those when I think I sort of gave an explanation earlier with sort of the values over time. That's one, obviously. And then when something is established, when it's already there, right? Then it's sort of okay. Then you sort of that's the one thing, and we haven't talked about it. There's also like sports as a sort of commercial entity. It's sort of that's sort of maybe understated in an article, but that's also a thing. Like it's sort of it's established as a way of status. So if you sort of manage to accomplish that and do that on an individual level, then of course your status you will sort of gain recognition for your performances. Then you will sort of be recognized for doing something important and something that matters and something that people care about, and then you sort of achieve status.
Because that was one of the things that I wondered. You've actually just mentioned it. I was thinking about the relationship of sport and status to spectatorship and fandom and celebrity. That certainly. I mean, my son's 20 now, so I'm just about coming out of that phase. But him and his friends are obsessed by footballers. So you can kind of imagine that that's why they want to be good footballers, and that's why the lads in the school who are the best footballers have a certain amount of status. And it's partly. So I'm just putting this forward for you to comment on, but it seems to be partly related to their intrinsic understanding and achievement of understanding of the game. So it's an internal good almost, that they know how good Erling Haaland is because they understand the game and they can see that it's very, very difficult to do and to achieve what it is that he achieves. But then on the other hand, I live in Manchester, where every time someone goes past you in a Ferrari, it's a good chance that they're from City or they're from United. There's the whole kind of sort of celebrity and the wealth, everything. I mean, but if that was true, you would then expect that success in some sports is more important than success in others. So I'll throw that over to you to comment on.
Yeah, could you just repeat the last thing you said? That some
so I'm thinking that you might imagine that it's not success at sport per se which confers status, but there's a hierarchy of sports. So maybe being good at, I don't want to insult anybody now, so now I'm trying to think of a sport that perhaps nobody does or is interested in, but being good at badminton. Anybody? No. So being good at badminton, perhaps, great, who cares?
Yeah.
But being good at football, that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's probably true. These athletes are like, if you look at the ones in my sample, they play football. Footballers look at footballers, and then you have handball players and skiers. It's an interesting combination of sports, because Norway is the top leading sort of ski nation in the world, also with handball. But what's interesting is that it's female handball, it's not the men's team. So I would assume that it's probably very sort of, if you think about the athletes in the sample, it's sort of context dependent on what sort of sports that matter for social status, of course. But it's of course, I think you're right. Like, there's certain sports are more prone to sort of convey or lead to status than others, of course.
And it's also, I was also just thinking though about that broader context of sport, that we don't just participate in sport, we also spectate in relationship to sport, and that's very important often to our identity as well. And so you kind of imagine that that's perhaps another dimension, that when kids are playing sport, their experience of that sport is perhaps mediated by and filtered through an imaginative relationship to what's going on in professional sport as well, particularly.
Yeah, it's a social modeling of what they sort of aspire to become, right? They develop a sort of, it's an anticipation, of course, and then it's a sort of trying to adapt to what they see and observe, type of learning situation, maybe you can call it. And then these people are the sort of major sort of standout people in society, and of course that's
I mean, you can sort of see it again, just to use the football example. When I took my son to play with his football team, I mean, firstly, all the coaches, despite the fact that these kids were only 7 or 8, when Pep Guardiola came to Man City, all these kids at 7 or 8 were trying to play out from the back. So there's this kind of sense of this is, and they all had they all had their goal celebrations worked out. So when any of them scored, they'd go into an elaborate set of cartwheels and all that. So you can kind of see that their experience of participation in is mediated by an identification with. It was just once you started talking about status, I kind of let my own imagination get the better of me, but sort of just thinking about these connections.
They all had that Ronaldo scoring.
Yeah. Okay. The only other thing I thought about that as well was with the gender differences, I suppose, the extent to which sport accords perhaps with old-fashioned and traditional masculine values. Maybe that would be why it would be, old-fashioned masculinity would be about being physical prowess, being strong, being fast, being tough. Does that? You said that the women in your sample status was sporting achievement was less of a factor in status for them. Is that something that you would explain through?
Sorry, could you repeat?
I think you said that sport was less of a source of status, I think, for the females in the sample.
In the general population.
The general population.
Yeah, so those who are in sport have to be committed, right?
Yeah.
So they might so they have to adopt and they have to be more motivated to stay on. Basically.
Which, just off the top of my head now, makes me think back to one of your earlier papers and the greater cohesion of the female networks. You might imagine that because it's more of a challenge for women in sport, because the payout for being good at sport isn't quite there in the wider population, maybe that makes you more dependent upon your fellow athletes and encourages more cohesive networks.
I think that's correct. And so you have the other, there's also another possibility. If you talk about traditional gender values, it could also be that we have this idea that girls are more concerned with or care about social unity and fellowship feelings, and that could also I don't really know which one or both, but I think that maybe, at least I think the one that you put forward is important, but you can't rule out the other one.
No.
It's also maybe present.
Okay, great, thank you. So if we move on to the fourth paper then, in that paper you say that so you're looking at the relationship of participation to educational achievement, and you say that the quality of sporting involvement affects that relationship. So that was. I just wonder if you can elaborate. Why does the quality of your sporting involvement bear upon the relationship between involvement and achievement?
I guess I would use the word matter for maybe. Because I think it's there's two. For example, enjoyment. If you take enjoyment, experiencing enjoyment can reflect, or to two things that are relevant there. First of all, enjoyment in itself sort of is a feeling of, you feel good, right? That's what enjoyment momentarily feelings of enjoyment is, which in itself is good and probably matter in some ways for how you feel and you have a good life. And then of course, enjoyment can also reflect, as I say, like a general sort of sense of how your life is going. It can sort of reflect life in school. So maybe it's sort of those experiencing enjoyment in school, I would sort of put forward, probably also are doing okay socially in school. It's basically just the sort of correlation between the two arenas that I'm sort of mapping out using social experiences in just one of them. Wish I had the other one as well. Okay. Yeah. So that's what I'm doing. And of course, sport performance is a little bit different because I sort of, my findings sort of go in the direction that, yeah, I say that's sort of experiences in sports, in terms of sport performances leads to some kind of or reflect commitment, time used, hard work, and so on and so forth, which sort of might draw attention away from school. So that's basically, yeah. So I think it's what I'm doing, yeah.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. You, in the introduction to the paper, you say that sports participation can reduce social inequality in schools. Can you elaborate on that, please?
I don't remember exactly what I said.
Sorry,
I have to look it up.
I'm probably not going to be able to find it, in which case maybe I'll just have to pass on that question.
Yeah, I was just, I'm not really sure if I remember exactly that sort of statement.
It wasn't, I don't think it was an integral part of the paper. It was just, again, one of those claims that struck me that was quite interesting. But never mind, if it wasn't a, I mean, if it wasn't, what's that called? That it wasn't important, it doesn't matter.
We can look at it in the post and maybe we can sort of address
yeah, maybe, yeah, it was perhaps a bit of a throwaway claim. But I've got a few more on this paper. I mean, one was you engage, I think at a number of points in the thesis, but particularly in this final paper, with James Coleman's thesis about the relationship between sport and educational achievement. And I mean, you seem quite sort of in the theoretical part of the paper, quite resistant to his idea. I mean, his idea, as I understand it, seems to be that the more that students are involved in sport, the less well they do in academic achievements. And in a sense, your findings kind of bear that out, but I sense a kind of resistance to that, and I just wondered why you disagreed with Coleman, assuming I understood correctly that you did.
Yeah. Maybe I'm not necessarily sure that I disagree, but I think that the only way to figure it out is to look at the experiences and what's going on. I think basically that's what I'm saying. Like, we really have to test this in order to come with those kind of claims. And the previous studies, as I say in the article, hasn't really done that. They sort of just look at participation or non-participation. That doesn't really tell us really what's going on. I think that's sort of just say that you have a sense of, and they use, the samples are so big in many of these studies that I sort of question the quality of those sort of outputs they give, because everything is statistically significant, so that doesn't tell us anything. So you need to scale it a little bit down, look at experiences, and then you can sort of address Coleman's claim. I'm not sort of, I don't think I don't want to take any sort of stance either for or against. I just want to test it. That's basically what I'm doing. Yeah.
Okay. So it's a sort of Popperian sort of, I'm going to oppose this for scientific purposes rather than theoretical.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think you can. Yeah.
Okay. So, well, you've already mentioned the sort of something about the nature of these surveys, because there were a couple of thoughts that I had about variables that were in that survey. One was a sort of key variable was that you used was athletes' own assessment of their of their sporting ability, and I was just a little bit cautious about this particular variable because that's always going to be dependent upon a reference group. So if I start in the local football team and I'm the best player, so I feel great, yeah, I'm a wonderful football player, and then I go and play for the county team, and then I'm playing alongside people who are equally good or better than me. So there's that sort of relativity to self-assessment, and you would imagine that might also affect enjoyment. That whilst I'm a big fish in a small pond, does that phrase translate? Yeah, I'm a big fish in a small pond, and that's great. So I feel wonderful about myself. But then as I play at progressively higher levels, and my reference group changes, you would imagine that my enjoyment might start to tail off because I don't feel that good about it anymore.
Yeah, I think I have 3 comments. One is that maybe that's probably correct. The other one is that it makes sense, but also it's like I don't think necessarily that sort of progressing takes the enjoyment out of sort of in the reference. There has to be there's a balance between you have to be sort of there has to be a reference group, but it can't go too far up and too far down. There has to be some sort of limits there. That's where you should be operating. Yeah. I think that's sort of the key, the thing that we're looking for and want sort of in sports. And my last comment is that in my sort of review of the article, I have sort of looked into and probably will change the sort of way I measure things, because I'm probably going to use the same one that I used in Article 3. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. I think I've probably just about got time for 2 more questions. So the first one is just going back now really to your earlier studies and going back really to the talk that you did right at the start. Is there a place for mixing methods in this kind of research? You kind of said, well, one way to approach this would have been through a narrative analysis or some sort of qualitative analysis, and you described some of the limitations of that approach, which network analysis allows you to avoid. But then, of course, network analysis itself is constraining, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts about the importance. Perhaps would some of the kind of undecidable issues that arise in your own research have perhaps been more tractable and more, you would have been able to analyse them in greater depth and detail if you had a qualitative component to your study? Is that something that you would
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that my sort of Article 1 in one sense is sort of just only show like one side of the page in a way, you could say that. And I think that every relationship is like its own unique story, right? And I wanted to qualitatively, and I think that it can be sort of done like you can sort of they complement each other pretty well, I think, because the network analysis, the sort of structural dimensions that you sort of map out, flesh out everything else, and then you're left with the structure, and then you could see individuals' positions in those networks. You could do that first, and then you can sort of, or you don't need to do that first. You can sort of qualitatively go in first as well, and then you can sort of go in and sort of, I think, qualitatively, just for example, talk to the people in the different relations. About their sort of social experiences with the relationships they have within the networks. I think that would sort of be a natural way to progress my research, and that's something that I want to do. I wanted to do it, or I sort of realized maybe halfway through, it was too late, because it's, you know how sort of time and research consuming it is to sort of collect network data. This is really like a major job, just collecting these descriptive data quantitatively. 30 teams with those iPads and driving around the country. It was like, it took 2 years, right? So I didn't really have time to sort of delve into the sort of qualitative part of it. But I realized very quickly that I should have done it. I think that was one of the first or like the second teams that I visited. I just realized I should really talk to these people some more and sort of bring that into my research. But I didn't have time. I realized that I just had to move on. So that was kind of frustrating, to be honest. So if I sort of, what I should have done maybe was like just followed up on one team, maybe like qualitatively 1-2 times, for example, through a season. Maybe just pick one team. Like maybe it's enough. There's enough information in one team, more than enough. So maybe I should have done that. I think that would have sort of complemented the stuff that's published in a nice way. I'm not really sure how, but I just know that there would be interesting aspects that these people would sort of tell me about their relationships. And I remember when I was doing my data collection, especially like the soccer and handball teams, it was a bit of like a rushed, so when you collected the data, you had to come there before or after practice usually. Then you collect the data, and you had to make sure that everybody was there, was concentrated, and so on. Keep the parents away, very important. Was a big issue. And so we had to stop many of the trainings a little bit earlier. But the ski teams were different, because when I collected data in the ski teams, in Norway it's kind of traditional that ski teams travel away for the weekends, and then they stay in hotels in the weekends. So that was a sort of nice opportunity for me to collect data. So I usually sort of, when are you planning to sort of go in a hotel and have training weekends? So they gave me the dates, and I went up there, often stayed in the same hotel or nearby, and they would invite me in. They were very curious about my research and just thought it was interesting and nice that there were other people, and just then they train, and then they sit like in the cabin for 6 hours and wait for the next training sessions. So I was there, I talked to the people, and they told me many interesting things. So I just, but I didn't sort of have, it wasn't in my sort of research application, so I couldn't use it. I didn't have consent to use that data, so it's none of that is present in the published works.
I probably should preface my question by saying you did a huge amount of empirical work, so I wasn't in any way suggesting you should.
No.
But no, okay. No, that's great and interesting to know. I mean, as a final question, I just sort of invite you to tell us all where it goes next. You've mentioned a few things, I think. Do you have plans to develop this research further, or are you taking a radical change of direction?
No, I'm just getting started, so I have to do more. I talked about the qualitative, just have to find a project that fits and all that. And then there's, of course, I only look at like a very sort of limited age range, 16 to 19, so it would be interesting to look at younger cohorts, I would say, and also elders, but especially youngers, because older athletes, then you're sort of talking about adult sports. It's interesting, but I want to do the children first, maybe, because I'm very keen. My sort of article one, I find that relations is pretty sparse. So that's has gotten me thinking, like, how does this look in like younger teams when a team is supposed to back my ideas? Like, how does a team sort of relationally start and develop? How do you sort of my sort of hypothesis is that they need sort of bonding, strong ties, right? I don't find much of that there, and I think it's because maybe they don't need it as much, right? The younger team perhaps do. So I want to look at the younger age cohorts, and of course I already said I want to look at time series, follow a team over a sort of period of time, maybe a season, maybe two. That would be interesting to see how the network sort of unfolds, and maybe look at the networks in relation to outcomes, performance, especially. Yeah, that's maybe. And of course, you can look at different sort of sporting levels, elite versus sort of grassroots sports, which I looked at. That's sort of also interesting. Yeah, that's some ideas I have.
Okay, well that's great. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you for indulging me with my questions. And you gave a very impressive response to everything that I asked. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to the first opponent, Professor Crosby. Thank you to the candidates so far. Thank you for an interesting discussion so far. We will be able to continue the discussion after a break. And the second opponent will be here. Now we will have a 15 minutes break and then be back in the auditorium. Thank you. Yeah, I was going to say that.
acknowledging that my voice does not carry at all. So if I don't use this, no one, maybe the front row will hear me, but no one else. So, congratulations, Håvard. Congratulations, supervisors. And congratulations, Annie Hall. Today is a big day for you, for your colleagues, and for the institution. Before we start, I want to express my gratitude to the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences for inviting me to be the second opponent for Håvard Bergesen Dalen's thesis defense. I'm very privileged to be here today and discuss this thesis with you. And I always try to make this photo on the first slide of the presentation something related to the thesis. And since my sport is boxing, most of my photos are boxing related. But I picked this one because since your thesis is about networks, and gender is an important, one of several key variables, but an important key variable, I thought this photo kind of illustrated some of these networks and the gender dimensions in everyday organized team sport. You could also call this picture kind of where's Wallow or where's the women? But there are two. And there's one teenage girl in this group of teenage boys. And while she's in the middle of the photo, she's behind the punching bag. But just to kind of set the tone a little bit, because we do have to talk a little bit about gender in the second part. But I want to start by saying, great job, Håvard. You have 4 scientific papers. You are first author of 3 of these papers. 3 of them are published in international journals. And you have 1 paper that's still going through the process. And you're also single author for that paper. So I just wanted to start by asking you if there's any updates on that 4th paper. Has anything happened since you delivered this thesis?
Yes, a very sort of thoughtful and heartful reject. So I have to sort of submit it to a new journal. But I'm in the process of rewriting it and sort of correcting the things that was suggested to be changed. It wasn't really like sort of major stuff, so I'm confident that it will be published. I'm not. Yeah.
Of course, I was hoping that you would say that it was accepted, but this reject is part of the game.
Yeah.
So if it's any consolation, my personal record is 11 desk rejects for the same paper. So for various reasons, we all get rejected. But through your extensive and rigorous work, you have produced this wonderful thesis, 208 pages, 74,468 words, which contributes to novel insights into the topic of sport and sociability, which is under research in youth sports studies. And through your work, you deliver empirical analysis which are novel and significantly contributes to how we understand social relations in organized sport. And I also want to commend you on the original and innovative research design. You already touched a bit on it today, but there is a methodological sophistication to your work, and I find that quite thrilling to read, to see that there is a PhD thesis that pushes the methodological norms or standards of the field of sociology of sport. That's not an easy thing to do, and I really applaud you for doing that. So there is this common sport saying that the best defense is a good offense, or in this case, the best thesis defense is a good thesis offense. But I want to try my best to avoid this kind of introduction, but now let's get into the questions and our conversation. Some of the things that I would like to discuss with you relates to the theoretical approach, and I have one particular theme with methods in the sample. We'll come back to that. But I mainly want to ask questions that kind of see the whole, or the 4 article as one piece of academic work. Kind of lift the gaze a bit. Especially in relation to findings and discussion and implication for practitioners. And the good thing is that I really saw that you took our evaluation to heart in the way you presented the thesis at the beginning to already start to go into this kind of meta perspective. So that's kind of the theme that we are moving into now. But I want to start here, very early in the thesis, and I don't know if the page numbers are the same because I'm using the thesis that we got before, finalized version, but we start here. So many professors would say that a good PhD thesis only has one research question. That 2 is too many. But you have a different approach. You have 4 questions and they align with the 4 articles. So they translate. And this, the good thing about this is that it makes it easy to see how each paper is a standalone piece of work, so the independency of each paper. But it can also challenge the coherence of the project or the thesis. So how these connect as one research project. So taking these 4 research questions and 4 papers into account, if you were to formulate one research question for your thesis, what would that be?
What is sports as a social arena? That's like basically what I'm asking. I'm sort of not sort of, and maybe you can put a comma on that and say, and what is its sort of outputs, or what does it lead to, or something like that. That's maybe what I'm doing here, because I sort of present questions that they all sort of tie in with not like an overall question, but with an overall sort of phenomenon, like which is sports as a social arena. That's sort of my framing of the articles and how they come together. They answer, as I sort of say in the introduction, 4 sort of dimensions of the same sort of macro or like overreaching sort of phenomenon. And yeah, you're supposed to write 4 articles, so then you sort of develop 4 themes that sort of link together and come together as a whole into that sort of overreaching, and sort of they do this sort of. I think they do that in a sort of coherent way because they sort of look into different things, but they all sort of comment, and this goes to my sort of ontological positioning, that they all sort of comes from and builds on these sort of theoretical underpinnings that relations matter. This is all about relations. All of this, like that's the sort of keyword there to understand how everything comes together. Yeah, so I would say that, and like I want to add like one thing here, and that is that I have 2 sort of social network methodological articles, and I have to admit that that's the wrong word. The plan was to have 4. That would probably make the thesis as a whole feel more like sort of that all the articles connect or align, or because they are sort of methodologically looks the same. So that was the plan, but sort of I touched upon this when I talked to Professor Crossley earlier, that sort of I couldn't get the data to work properly. I wanted to look at networks in relation to outcomes. Didn't really work, so then I sort of had to sort of just adjust myself and use the other data, sort of in my survey to the best of my abilities to make them sort of connect with the two first articles, and I personally feel that they sort of do. But yeah.
Of course they do. If they didn't, this defense would probably not be today. You might have to have done some revisions, but if we take this, what is sport as a social arena? That would be your overarching question. I want to probe a bit more into this, because I get the feeling in your thesis that relations matter, and you really want to go into these social relations in sport. But then you're also kind of interested in these outside influences and that the direction of those kind of both ways, which is also interesting and relevant, but it's a bit of a different thing, maybe. And then the meaning of sport for other networks and vice versa. So if we take this, I know it's kind of put you on the spot, this research question, what is sport as a social arena? Wouldn't the sport research question, wouldn't that fit on the side of that? Or how do you see that?
I think, I don't know, I think it's, you can sort of, it reflects, it sort of plays off on like another, I agree that it sort of plays off on like another sort of aspect of the thesis, but you can sort of, okay, let's frame it in my research question another way. You can say like more of a critical question. I think that my thesis sort of, a question, an overreaching question that I feel my thesis sort of answers out, and that is like, we sort of, I already said this, we sort of put a lot of weight on organized sports. It's supposed to deliver all these sort of different outcomes in terms of health, education, enjoyment, generally like social development for kids. I feel like my sort of thesis sort of comes with, it sort of ends with a question really, like how can we really know what sports sort of leads to if it doesn't know what it looks like? And so I sort of, the first article sort of addresses the second part of that question, and the other one starts to dip into sort of start looking at outcomes. So yeah.
Okay, good. Let's move on a bit to the theoretical approach. And one thing that I really like about your thesis is that you are quite open about the development of the methodological and the theoretical approaches that take place during this kind of long research project. So based on that, I want to invite you to elaborate a bit on this process of development and learning. So talk us through this development of different approaches to analyzing the social of youth sport. How did you come to approach social networks in slightly different ways, as you put it? And why not stick to just one way? Because surely that would have been easier. And secondly, this realization that your project is situated within relational sociology, how did that come about?
Yeah, we can take the first topics to the process. How did you come to approach those networks slightly different? I think it's sort of, first of all, it's like scientific curiosity that shouldn't be under sort of played there. First, I do like a descriptive sort of analysis, presentation of social networks. And I just felt that it sort of came very naturally. Okay, this is what they look like, and then you sort of have to figure out how they sort of come into being. It's just that was really sort of my basic, and then as I said earlier, like you start to learn about what social network analysis is, and then you sort of have to collect data at the same time. And then you sort of assess during that period, what kind of data do I have? Because you don't have control. That's very important there. You don't really have control over sort of over all the sort of things that factor in when you sort of from this sort of process of developing an idea and the sort of data that the data collection and the data you're left with after when you do something like sort of exploratory like this. So you sort of at the end of the day you sort of see what you got, and like the first article was very like, and that's the one in my when I wrote my sort of application. That article was very like clear to me. It has to be done. And then the other ones I sort of kept more open because I didn't have knowledge. So I just realized I read the books. I have to sort of collect the type of data that allows me to do different things. And then I was I was not sort of sure on how many teams I had to collect data from. It's kind of difficult with network analysis because sort of the unit of analysis is basically the number of relations. You don't sort of count on team stuff. You don't really count records like you do in traditional statistics. So it was a very sort of organic process, really. So I just started with the basic network stuff, and then you sort of read up, and then you sort of Bergesen comes to you in the office and gives you the book of exponential randomized graph models. Read this thing, and then you sort of get ideas, and then you sort of test it, find out this is interesting, it works, okay? Yeah, that's basically the first two articles. And then I already mentioned this, that like I had troubles with sort of the data set to do it. To do more network analysis, then you sort of just have to sort of take things in a different direction and use other methods. Yeah, I was just very open to doing different things, and I could maybe you can do like I could have sort of stayed within Article 1 and sort of developed my findings regarding to gender more, for example, or looked at other attributes and stuff like that, but. I don't know, I wanted to just push it a little bit further and see what comes out of it, basically. So that was sort of my process. And that's important, like you write an application and if you sort of suggest 4 articles and doing a PhD, especially when you do something that hasn't been done before, like social network analysis, interpersonal relationships hasn't been studied this way before, so you know, it's very difficult to sort of within sort of a pre-planned sort of and then elaboration on positioning within relational sociology is I don't know, you sort of social network analysis is both theory and methods, right? So I sort of started with this popularized version of social network analysis, 6 degrees of separation and so forth. So then I think maybe I started with the methods. So so you see, it's very visual. Oh, like you see these networks. Everybody knows the popular version of social network analysis. So I started there. Then you sort of start to dip into the theories behind the sort of descriptives that sort of end up as Article 1. And then you sort of pretty early I sort of found relational sociology. It's heavily referenced and it's many of the same people. So. And I just found it very interesting, and certainly, like, there's always this interplay between you and the articles, and then I just sort of decided fairly early to sort of just position myself pretty clearly, like, within that camp. I think it sort of gave myself a sort of confidence and a sort of understanding of what I was doing, really. So. Yeah, that's basically how that sort of happened. I'm not like, if you look at the way if you just sort of look at the way things, the output is, of course, I'm not like what should we call it, like a relational, radical constructivist, really. It's not like I sort of say that way too early. I'm not there yet, so we'll see in the end, a couple of years, but yeah. So yeah, it's just served as a sort of pretty early, like it sort of gave me like a ontological and epistemological sort of position that I can sort of work from, and I realized that it would help me in the end when I have to write sort of the summary kappa, to have something to sort of hold on to that sort of gives you that a clear direction and a sort of output that sort of makes sense and is coherent. And you need that when you sort of, because I realized that this is like, I see the other sort of PhDs around me that have more like maybe more like defined projects from the start, and I sort of realized that I need something to sort of hold on to. Otherwise things could just sort of float out. Yeah.
So you were kind of jumping into the methods of things and the excitement of exploring new methods and new approaches, and the relational sociology became a theoretical anchoring towards the second half of the project? Or?
Yeah. Definitely. Because that's when things started to get like, when you had the two first articles done, and then you find out that the data sort of doesn't really help. They sort of give you a little bit of pushback, and then you sort of need some guidance on where to sort of, how to sort of get these things to sort of hang together. Yeah, and sort of, yeah.
It's quite nice to hear you talk about that, because sometimes in this article-based theses you get pushed or pulled into another approach or theory from the review process. So hearing that it's actually more organic development for your project is quite nice, I think.
Also, I just, on a personal level, I find sort of, I find that sort of I like sort of ontological reflections. I just, on a personal level, find them interesting. So it probably makes it easier to sort of go into that and sort of state things in a thesis. Yeah.
Yeah, as an evaluation member, that's always nice, because some people will just skirt over any ontological questions if they could. But I can see that this following the methods and developing the project, it makes sense that for me your thesis kind of, it tries to grasp a lot of different things. And I think that's kind of going back to the research question, to kind of consolidate that, then becomes the drawback. So building on that in terms of theoretical coherence and the theoretical approach,
sure, you could probably just stay within sports, but I just think that it makes it's interesting to sort of look at. I just think it's interesting, and it gives more value to what goes on in sports if you sort of look at the sort of wider consequences of those relations. It's basically just that, to be honest. That's sort of why I sort of took that sort of into the thesis. I think it sort of complements the idea, but then again, I can also see that when you only have 4 articles, maybe you should just save something for the postdoc and just maybe I just stayed within sports. Of course, I could probably have done that. Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to sort of elaborate much more on that. Again, it's also it's a certain level of sort of pragmatism involved there. It's what the data could do. I had 387 athletes. I had a small sample. I didn't have a large survey really. Some of the questions didn't really work. There was a little bit of noise on some of the questions, like answers that I was sort of uncertain about the quality on some of the measures, so I decided not to use them. So then you sort of build on what you have and what seems to work, and then you just sort of incorporate it the best you can. That's really sort of what we're seeing here. That explains sort of the output.
It's more a pragmatic thing, or how it turned out to be because of data.
Yeah.
Or you would include this kind of inside-outside perspective anyway.
Very difficult to say. If I had the data, I'm not sure, honestly, what would have been. That's very difficult to sort of speculate on. But I don't really see it as a problem that I sort of incorporate the sort of wider sort of dimensions of it.
No,
and also
you
like.
should tell me why it's not a problem, because like in 25 minutes you're going to be a doctor. So
Yeah.
it's interesting. Should you follow up with something? Why is it not a problem?
Yeah, also, like, I want to say, like, the social significance is a bit different than the social consequences, because social significance says something about how factors outside of sports can sort of make its way into sports and sort of matter for what goes on in sports. So that one is a bit different than the other one. But like, know how to approach this, but I just sort of feel like I said in the beginning, that highlighting how something sort of the wider consequences of what goes on in sports isn't that a value in itself? Sort of, I think so.
So it's kind of so interlinked that it doesn't make sense to, or you need this.
Or you can choose to, yeah.
Okay, I think we should move on a bit. In the theory chapter, you also argued that there is a mismatch between sociological theory and research methods. And you argue that the theories about social groups and systems, they tend to downplay the significance of face-to-face interactions. You also talked about this morning. So I have 2 questions about this. Firstly, are these critiques of empirical research equally applicable to both quantitative and qualitative studies of youth sports, and how? And secondly, what theories are you really critiquing, and how does your relational approach mend this?
Yeah, the first part, there's sort of said it's two parts there. Yeah, okay. The first part is very sort of, I see it as like, it's about methods, basically. So, when we do statistical inferences and try to look at social phenomena with statistical modeling, as I said, we usually look at aggregated data. What happens then? You completely lose context, right? You don't get a hold of the context. That's the problem with like traditional survey method, for example. The context is gone, and I find it super important, so I have to find some way to sort of grasp that context, sorry. And the second part is that, yeah, critiquing social psychology, to be honest. Just very, very clear maybe when you read that. Again, we lose context. We get a lot of we get sort of very good understandings of how people feel about stuff. And their social experiences from their point of view, but we don't really see how these sort of ideas are born in the sort of relationship between the individual and structures they operate in, right? And that's where network analysis comes into play, because you can sort of see how people act. They do some kind of behavior. A relationship is born, another one is broken down. In the like say you're in a sports group, one person develops new relationships to an athlete, another athlete develops a relationship to another athlete. Sort of from that, a new structure arrives. All athletes in the team will now have new sort of structural positions, which gives them sort of possibilities. It may come with constraints. They act within that. You get agency because they have to choose. Do I go there? Do I go there? Right? And then you sort of, you can sort of, in that way, sort of network analysis brings sort of this sort of micro and micro level together. Sort of, you get them working together. And that's what the relational approach does. And I find it really useful, and it sort of brings also context into the picture, basically.
Just a bit back to the first one, because I get this from a quantitative standpoint, but when I read your piece, I was thinking, okay, but what about qualitative, field work, and when you're really, I would say that they kind of, from a different lens, but you can also grasp some of these things.
Some, yes.
Yeah, some.
No, different, a little bit different. I agree.
Yeah, I'm just thinking on the critique that we focus on variables. It's very clearly directed towards the quantitative.
Yeah, and mainly sort of, that's the main sort of methodological approach I'm critiquing. I'm not critiquing qualitative data sort of methods there. It's the quantitative sort of camp. That's because I do quantitative approach in my thesis. That's why I critique quantitative first and foremost. And I sort of said that qualitative data has maybe a sort of a limitation, but it doesn't sort of take away the value of that work. It sort of, I think it complements network analysis very nicely. Yeah, it's basically it's the sort of quantitative statistical, because that was sort of, I'm a numbers guy, so that was mainly primarily, so that was maybe like what I saw when I started this project, that was like maybe an alternative. Wasn't delivered. So then you sort of develop what you do in reference to something that you critique, to understand what's the value of the things that you actually end up doing.
Yeah, today hearing you talk about it and kind of the quantitative literature on youth sport, and I'm wondering if you almost have more
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. I think I have to take that one with me home. Just sort of self-realization going on there. But yeah, I think maybe you're right. Relational sociology and social network analysis, because it's so sort of context, it's sort of it needs context to work, and it sort of shows the value of studying context. It's natural that you sort of become sort of drawn into the positive sides, especially when you use methods like mine that is so structure heavy, and you know the sort of limitations in the output. Then you really want to know what's going on, and you need to find like the content and the meanings of the relationships that you sort of discover. So then, of course, yeah, then you sort of find an interest, and you sort of see the value of doing like quality work. And, yeah, I think you're right about that.
We have to talk a bit about gender. It's another important part of your thesis and the theory and the findings. And I think it's really good that you give gender space in your thesis, because it is an identity dimension that shapes all of our relations and interactions with others. And of course, youth sport is no exception to this. And one thing that I kind of noticed in your thesis, and especially in the literature review, the theory section, is that most of the literature on gender is from outside of the Nordic countries. And I'm wondering if that might be a bit problematic when it comes to discussing these gender differences. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, maybe. We might be over, again, the context. We're in Norway. My data is from Norway. And yeah, sort of, Norwegian sports is maybe a bit more sort of gender equal than sports in many other countries and regions. So, yeah, that's certainly it's a sort of fair critique maybe towards the project. Can you repeat the question? I just
No, yeah, but you're kind of going into my point, because, for instance, there are a lot of North American English citations, and like you say, gender means different things in different contexts. And I think you can say it in Norwegian sports, but even Nordic sports, gender expressions might manifest in different ways, because gender relations here is not the same as in North America, for instance. So that impacts sport. Can you kind of go on with here on gender, and I like that you kind of point to the variations in context, in sporting context, in terms of gender relations and gender meanings, because just as you write, there are probably significant variations between sports, depending on gender balance, imbalance. And you, of course, you have 3 sports: football, handball, and 4. I don't know if you want to count cross country, biathlons. So say 4 sports with their own gendered distributions. So I guess I'm kind of, I want some reflections on how this impacts your findings, or what you can say. I'm kind of questioning, can we really say something about sport teams and gender in general? Knowing that in sports the gender distributions are so different. Take the boxing picture from the first and compare it to the ski or the biathlon or the gender segregated
question you asked sort of points to some of the limitation in my data that like I only have 3 sports, or maybe, and that you sort of one thing that is sort of the sort of mixed teams are also sort of downplayed in my sort of gender comparisons in Article 1. They're not really part of that discussion, and also like I guess. One of the things that makes it difficult to study gender also is that gender they're segregated from the start. Makes it really like difficult to assess really sort of the gender dimension. And there's sort of if you have a team, maybe I should have more teams, more diverse range of teams, more both sort of segregated sports, but also sports where boys and girls sort of participate together. It would have been interesting to sort of more better shed light on it, sort of gender, how gender sort of is linked to social relations that I'm sort of mapping out.
I don't think you needed more of anything really in your thesis, and I think it's a strength that you do have both the gender mixed teams and the segregated, because it kind of shows and acknowledges the differences. I'm more, my critical question would more be if it makes sense to talk about gender and sports teams broadly at all.
Yeah, that you have to sort of look into the particulars, you mean? Yeah, maybe. But that's where you sort of could have sort of, instead of having just 3 different sports, you could have sort of had 8 different sports or something like that. Then you sort of, maybe you can say a little bit more about sort of, answer that question in a little bit more.
Yeah, or just say that this is about football or handball.
Yeah, it was just, be more.
Not necessarily more. I'm not, in that specific area, I'm more questioning if it makes sense to generalize or if it's possible.
Yeah, I understand. I don't think you can sort of, my goal with these projects was never to be heavy on the generalization part. I sort of realized that you get 30 teams, and so that's why I sort of said that you can maybe look at different sports and then you can sort of maybe get a sort of richer kind of data, and then you can say, so that was more that I was going for. Yeah.
And I really like this. I highlighted it in blue at the end, that it's kind of call for research moving forward, that we know little about whether girls and boys' social relations in sport reflect the increased participation of girls and current discourses about gender in sport. So I want to ask you, what would be your hypothesis? How this development impacts social relations in youth sport?
Sort of increased participation.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just have to take a step back.
Yeah, so I can simplify it.
Yeah, it's still a lot of text, sorry. It's a little long there.
The fact that more girls are participating in more sports, what does it do to the social relations? How does it impact this development? What would be your hypothesis based on your findings?
Yeah, more girls into sports, more girls sort of making their way into sports that have been traditionally sort of on the male domain. If you sort of start with the idea that sort of society in general becomes more gender equal, then maybe we could expect sport activities to maybe it's sort of 2 outcomes. I don't know the answer, but maybe sort of we can sort of that sort of idea is transmitted and sort of is allowed to sort of evolve within sports teams as well, or you can get sort of a pushback. I don't know. That could also be like sports culture is strong male-dominated structural sort of power arrangements that sort of gives a bit of a pushback. I'm not really sure what the outcome would be, but sort of that maybe is, I'm not really sure that I'm completely, my thesis sort of answers these questions. At least it raises it and then puts it on the agenda. I think that was my main sort of
Yeah, but
goal.
I do think it raises a good point for further research and kind of seeing, because you do find some gender differences in these networks and in the girls' teams and the boys' teams and what kind of happens in the mixed teams. And maybe over time, we talk about following a team over time, where this kind of gender relations change. So I think it's a good kind of point to further work here. You already talked quite a bit about the strengths and weaknesses of the sample, so we can skip that, but I still want to ask you to reflect a bit on this second question, the socio-demographic groups of youth. I think you can say football and handball are likely to get a diverse. They're very popular. And skiing and biathlon as an individual sport. You mentioned it yourself earlier today. The price of a rifle, for instance. So
Yeah. The ski teams are very like, they're very like homogeneous in terms of who the participants are. It's sort of upper middle class participants, parents from a sort of social class. There's sort of, I talked about sports capital. These are youths with high sports capital, comes from privileged families. So there's a certain, it's just a small sort of, so it's a small, very sort of defined sample of children, not reflecting sort of more of children participating in individual sports in like a broader, more population sense. So yeah, it's upper class sort of children. It's not sort of ethnical diverse, for example. It's it's a special group in one sense. It doesn't. So I wanted to include the thing about it. It's nodal sampling. The thing about these sort of things is that they're easy to reach. So they say yes when you call, right? So I had limited time, so you sort of go with what you got, and so you don't say no when they say we can participate. You just call them up and they say it's okay. So then you sort of you go to them and you collect the data, of course, but sort of it would have been interesting to have youth from all layers of society and from more different sports, especially on the individual side, represented in the sample. It's,
but if you were to pick like one or two individual sports that kind of are more ethnically diverse or more kind of working class, what would you?
What I would choose.
Do you have any ideas what could complement biathlon in that sense?
I don't know. Athletics maybe could have been something. I think maybe I would have gone there. It's quite large in participation numbers. Doesn't necessarily require a lot of equipment and so on. So many people can sort of do that if they want to. The problem was, of course, as I say, that I wasn't allowed by the ethics board to sort of collect data on youth younger than 16. So 15 years was and younger. I couldn't have those youths in my sample. And the athletics teams often involves like 13-year-olds and up to 25-year-olds. And if you collect those data and you sort of turn them into networks, then you sort of get biased data, because then you have to pick out the 15-year-olds and the 14-year-olds and the 13-year-olds. The centrality measures become so long, so you get poor data that doesn't work. So I had to sort of just drop that idea, and I went with those teams that had the sort of correct sort of age sort of lower age limit that I was allowed to collect data on. So yeah, that was sort of.
Yeah, I do think that's a really important point because a lot of them would have dropped out before 16, so it's a pity that we weren't allowed to go a bit further down. I think I have time for one more question, so let's move on a bit to the discussion. In your concluding discussion, you move a bit beyond the research questions, which I would say in itself is a good thing. It shows independence and applicability and a bit of depth. But maybe it could also be critiqued for raising a slightly different topic. You discussed dropout quite a bit here. And dropouts may be one of the themes that have most research in youth sport. And you also build heavily on articles 1 to 3. So my last critical questions would be, why do we need this dropout discussion in this important thesis about social relations that in itself is a good topic to discuss?
Sorry, did I interrupt you?
No.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I want to discuss dropout because social network can shed new light on social network analysis can shed new light on how dropout occurs, and I want to sort of pinpoint that that's maybe I just want to sort of look into that. And also I look at the dropout and participation because this is something that matters for sports organizations. I want to just give something back, basically. That's why I sort of bring that into discussion. I want to show how relations and networks can actually be utilized and provide knowledge, basically, in my presentation earlier today. So that's why I sort of bring that into the thesis, basically. Yeah. I don't see it as a problem that not all articles are used to answer a simple piece of a dissertation. Like, not all articles can contribute in the same way in all parts of a large thesis that is explorative, covers a lot of ground. So I didn't. What you could have done, I could have probably tried to force that article in there to sort of see if it brings something, but I felt that it was, the 3 other articles gave me enough, and they sort of, and they are more, maybe more clear, they are maybe even more relational than the last one in a sense. So yeah, that's basically why I ended up the way it did.
I think that's a good answer. It doesn't have to be leveled all the time. So I think we're out of time, so any other questions we can discuss at some other points. But for now, congratulations on your thesis. And I'm going to say this in Norwegian. Gratulerer så mye med et flott stykke akademisk arbeid. Jeg håper du fortsatt får forske på samfunnsvitenskapelige idrettsspektret, problemstillinger her, og at vi møtes i fremtiden på andre faglige sammenhenger.
Er det berørt av hørt om norsk? Takk skal du ha.
Thank you very much to Professor Kjendal and the candidate for that discussion. Now, the examination committee will leave the room together with me to evaluate the dissertation, and the examination committee will make their final decision on the dissertation. I also examination committee has found Håvard Bergesen Dalen's dissertation on September 3rd, 2024 satisfactory. And as rector of Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, I hereby award Håvard Bergesen Dalen the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, PhD in Sport Science. Congratulations. You will receive your diploma August next year at the ceremony at the start of the next year, and you will receive the traditional institutional gift at the reception afterwards today. Then I declare the disputation for completed, and I will ask the committee and our new Doctor of Philosophy to join me in the procession out of the auditorium. Thank you.
The example from the half was just so bad. I thought, you know what? I think clearly. He had some kind of response to something. I got a lot of people I know. Ja, men det er et jævla problem. Det irriterer meg litt. Det er jo ikke noe samtale. Jeg synes det er like piss som basert.
I said to him, you should have opened up for discussion because there's so much that's not accurate in it.
Ja, men kom igjen, det er jo akkurat det samme pisset. Davy og det